Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about how to ruin your homebrew's taste. So you want to avoid this at all costs, and out of all my batches in the past, so whether it's making wine, beer, cider, there are four main reasons why I had to throw away the batch. It tasted so bad I couldn't save it. And usually what happens is that when you make a bad batch, you try to save it. So you try to add a little bit more water here, a little bit more sugar there. However, it doesn't always work and the aftertaste can remain, and that aftertaste does not taste good. So I've given you four reasons for which I was not able to save my batch. It was just really bad regardless of what I tried to do. And by the way, as a side note, when you add sugar after your fermentation is done, this is called back sweetening. And this happens when you're done your fermentation and your wine, beer, or cider, or any other type of drink is not sweet enough. So you add sugar and you make sure that it's not fermented by the yeast. So the sugar stays in your batch and it makes your whole drink sweeter or have a better taste. So what made my batches undrinkable, number one, is to ferment at a temperature that's too high. Some of you may notice that my background is a little bit different, and that's because I've changed locations, and in this location, the heating is centralized. So it's pretty hot. In the winter, summer, all year round, it's pretty warm. And I put my beer, it was fermenting near a heated area, and it was just too warm in this place and it stressed the yeast out. So when the yeast is too warm, it gets stressed, it gets overly activated, and it produces off flavors. Therefore, when I tasted the beer, it did not taste bitter, but it tasted sour. And this is not sour beer. It was meant to be regular beer. I did not add any lemon or any souring aspects into my homebrew, and the taste was not warranted. And for those wondering, the optimal temperature for beer to ferment in is 26 degrees Celsius, and that's 26 degrees Celsius within the fermentation jar. Therefore, your environment could be a little bit hotter or a little bit colder, but just make sure inside the jar it is at 26 degrees Celsius or roughly around that temperature. And if I had to compare, I would say that where I usually ferment, it's typically roughly 4 to 5 degrees Celsius colder than where I put the homebrew this time, and that deeply affected the yeast because all the other ingredients were the same. Speaking of yeast, a second aspect that can make your homebrew undrinkable is adding the wrong yeast. So this happens often for new homebrewers or when you're willing to test new products out. So there are liquid yeast, there are powdered yeast. However, the yeast that most homebrewers avoid is turbo yeast. Why turbo yeast? Because it gives off flavors as well. And adding turbo yeast is not as bad as fermenting in a too hot temperature, I must admit. My first batches were made of turbo yeast. However, as I've modified my recipes, I started using EC1118 yeast afterwards. And turbo yeast, usually it's used by new home brewers, and the reason why is that it includes yeast nutrient. Therefore, you do not need to buy another package of yeast nutrient. Your turbo yeast already includes it, and what yeast nutrient does, it activates the yeast faster, so it performs quicker at a better rate, meaning that it eats the sugar to produce alcohol faster. And turbo yeast can give you alcohol like that. It can give you alcohol, some in 1 day, some in 48 hours. Therefore, it's really quick. And for those impatient brewers out there, they use this to get quick alcohol. Another way to get quick alcohol, by the way, is to ferment at a higher temperature. So when you ferment at a low temperature, contrarily, your yeast will become dormant. It's like when it's cold, people want to stay home, they're lazy, no one wants to do any activities, and your yeast will take a longer time eating the sugar. However, once you put turbo yeast in a hot temperature and yeast nutrient, your fermentation will go faster. Another element to make your fermentation finish quicker, by the way, is by adding less sugar, because by adding less sugar, the yeast will have less food to eat and will finish your fermentation quick. Going back to the yeast, so as I use EC1118, that is a wine and champagne yeast, and as I started my first batch of beer, I did not have any beer yeast, so I added this wine and champagne yeast to ferment my beer, and surprise, surprise, it still tasted like beer. And the reason why is because of hops. Once you have hops, which are a form of green palate that has grapefruit, different types of flavors, fruity or other types of aromas, and that's what makes the taste of beer. That's what gives it its bitterness. And the yeast, honestly, it typically influences the flavor of your alcohol, but it did not influence the taste of the beer to make it taste like wine or champagne. Speaking of wine and champagne, in order to make wine, people usually crush grapes. However, if you want to make it with simple ingredients that you can find from the grocery store, you can use any type of fruit. However, this leads me to my third mistake that made my alcohol undrinkable. So it was when making wine, I added fresh fruit to the mix. And fresh fruit, what's wrong with fresh fruit? You might think it's great, it's authentic, you can squeeze, it's a nice little activity. However, beware when you leave fresh fruit out in the open for weeks, it tends to become rotten. And you can leave this out in the counter. You do not have to put this in your home brew to notice that fresh fruit that's not put in the fridge or that's left out for too long will have rot. You can have mold even. However, I've never had mold in my batches. This will be seen as white bubbles inside your home brew, and this probably means that you did not disinfect your equipment well. In order to disinfect, you can use tar sand, rinse it with hot water. Just make sure that you do not melt any plastic material or break any glass by using boiling water. Going back to the fresh fruit. So the solution with fresh fruit, in order to avoid rot, is to remove, so to scoop them out after a few days. Usually I would leave them up to 3 days, roughly. Or you can add preservatives to preserve these fruits. However, by adding preservatives, it acts as a double-edged sword because preservatives act against the yeast, although they preserve the fruit. And once you act against the yeast is not able to eat the sugar. And the whole point of the yeast eating the sugar is to make alcohol. Therefore, when you add preservatives, you're typically going to end up with a batch with high sugar and low alcohol. Some alcohol will be produced, but not much. I would guarantee from 1 to maybe 2 or 3% because the preservatives are inhibiting the yeast from doing its job. Therefore, if you don't want to scoop your fruit or add preservatives because the taste won't taste like wine at the end of the day because it'll be too sweet. What you can do is add juice instead. Just make sure that this juice does not have preservatives. So if you see sulfites in the ingredients, for example, that's a preservative. Usually ingredients that we're not able to understand are preservatives. However, there are 2 types of preservatives that are okay and that cooperate with yeast, and this is ascorbic acid and malic acid. It's malic and ascorbic acid, and these 2 are good with the yeast. Therefore, you can still have that in your juice and produce alcohol that tastes like wine. The fermentation will go all the way till the end, even if those 2 preservatives are in the juice. And you have to really read the label to make sure that no other preservatives are present. For example, in lemon juice, there is typically sulfites, and in some types of cranberry juice, there's other types of preservatives. However, what I've noticed in the past is when I get apple juice, this usually has the good preservatives. So the malic and ascorbic acid, they usually have these type of preservatives, and the alcohol is able to ferment until the end. One little tip when using juice that some may not think of is that you want to make sure that the juice that you're choosing has the same color as the wine you want to achieve at the end. For example, if you want to make red wine, I would not suggest using green juice, for example. You can get red juice. What I use is cranberry, and a little tip is when you use organic juices. Organic usually means free of preservatives, natural ingredients. So if you want to make sure that there's no preservatives inhibiting the yeast, I would go to the organic kind. And you also want to make sure that it has a little bitter or a little acidity in the juice, because if you choose regular sweet cranberry juice and you add yeast, the final product will not taste like wine because it will be missing that acidity, that bitterness, that little texture that makes it taste like wine. On the contrary, if you want to make white wine, I would suggest using a juice that has the same color as white wine, therefore golden, yellowish, whitish, to make sure that your final product has the same color as the white wine, and make sure it also has that acidity and a little bit of bitterness, since white wine has less bitterness than red wine. It's more acidic. And you can even squeeze the juice of fruits. For example, if you're looking for acidity, you can squeeze the juice of the lemon inside your home brew. However, you have to make sure that on top of having no preservatives, that your pH is at the optimal level, because if the pH is too low, which is the case for lemon or lemony mixes, the yeast will have a hard time eating the sugar because it's not in its preferred environment. In that case, if you're adding lemon or any juice that's too sour or acid, you want to make sure that the pH is 5, because the optimal pH for yeast is at 5.2. And how do you make sure that the pH is at 5.2? There is an item, it's calcium carbonate, and once you add a little bit of calcium carbonate, the pH level will go up, and you can add as much as it takes for the pH to reach 5.2. And how do you know what the pH is? There are two methods to verify this, two main methods. So you have the digital pH meter or pH strips. And coming from someone that has used both, I would recommend the pH strips, because the digital pH meter, first you need to calibrate it every time you use it, and this takes a while. It's also more expensive, and it's as reliable as the pH strips. Therefore, I would go with the pH strips. It's easier to use, it's cheaper. What you have to do is take a little orange band and dip it inside your solution and compare the color of the strip to the colors of the pH. And the colors of the pH vary from yellow to purple, and the optimal pH color should be orangey red. That was the third thing that ruined homebrew. It's adding fruits. And the fourth element that ruined the taste of my homebrew was adding oak chips. And when adding oak chips, this is usually at the end of your batch. You do not want to add this before fermentation. But how winemakers, for example, age their wine, they put it in big barrels and they leave it there for years. However, if you do not have the space for barrels, do not fret. You can purchase oak chips. It could be American oak chips. You have different types of oak chips. You have three main types of oak chips. And what you have to do is rinse them, dry them, and once they're dry, you have to toast them. And you have to toast them to a certain temperature, and the temperature is gonna give you different flavors. Here's the chart to show you what temperature leads to what flavors of oak chips. And once you toast them to that level, you can insert them inside your homebrew after the fermentation process. However, I typically add too much oak chips, and every time I add them, the batch tastes like wood and it has to be thrown away because it's undrinkable. And drop a comment below and let me know, do you use oak chips? I'd be curious to know if some people have used this instead of aging their wine in barrels. And if you'd like tips and tricks on what to avoid in homebrewing, what I would suggest, book a class. The link is in the description below. And if you found this video valuable, share with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.